Roquan Smith is a Baltimore Raven, and the Chicago Bears are loaded up with draft picks and cap space for next offseason. It feels like the teardown portion of the rebuilding process is just about over, so now all of the pressure is on Ryan Poles to do something with all this cap space and draft picks he's acquired.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, including some ongoing Roquan Smith discussions over there. And make sure you click that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today and hopefully every single day. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. You pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can get 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with our promo code LOCKEDON. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. On the show today, normally we would be going through the All-22 film of the Bears' loss to the Dallas Cowboys, but the Roquan Smith trade, tiny bit more important, don't you think? We'll look at what the move leaves the Chicago Bears with in terms of cap space, in terms of draft picks, and how so much of that pressure is now on Ryan Poles that this offseason, all right, you got the clean slate, you got the resources, let's see what you can do. And so much is going to hinge on what he is able to do with all of these resources. We'll kind of look at the dynamics that led to the trade, where it leaves the team on the field now without Roquan Smith, this defense missing its star linebacker, what they'll do to try and replace him and what impact that could have in the remaining games this season. And we'll wrap up just peeking around and say, okay, the Bears are reportedly maybe not done on the trade market. Maybe by the time you hear this podcast, another move will be done. So we'll look at what could be in the works, either departing Chicago or maybe even coming in to Chicago. But let's start with the Roquan Smith trade itself. You already know the details. We don't have to go through everything up. But to me, the trade seems to be a very clear indication that the Bears made up their mind, right? They said, you know what? We're not gonna be able to re-sign him. We're just, for whatever reason, we're not going to be either that interested in re-signing him, or we just don't think with his lack of agent and how things went in the preseason, we just don't think Roquan Smith re-signing with the Bears is going to happen. They likely thought that the other possibility would be to franchise tag him and then trade him if, you couldn't re-sign him. But you make the trade now, you get the bird in the hand here as opposed to 2 in the bush later on this offseason. You get, a pretty high draft. Well, we'll see exactly how high, but a second-round pick is still going to be a top 64 draft pick, certainly, to add to your mix, plus the 5th rounder is a pretty good return. I was kind of thinking maybe a little more would have been in the works, but I guess you throw in the linebacker A.J. Klein, and that bumps up a little bit more. So I don't think by no means do I think it was any sort of I saw some people trying to claim that the Ravens, fleeced the Chicago Bears in this trade. I don't see it that way at all. I would have thought the Bears maybe could have got a little more, not a first-round pick, but a little more, but when it's all said and done, the Ravens aren't guaranteed to re-sign Roquan Smith. So there's some considerable risk on their end. If they do let him walk, they could maybe get a 3rd-round compensatory draft pick to make up for what they ended up giving up in this trade. But regardless, this is Ryan Poles really putting some of the final teardowns on this roster. That after today, when the trade deadline hits, that'll really be the end of the teardown process. It'll be as torn down as you can possibly be heading into this offseason, when it's time to really build things back up. The teardown's been kind of ongoing over the last, 10 months since Ryan Poles took over, and now you have 9 draft picks, a 1st-rounder, 2 2nd-rounders, a 3rd-rounder, 2 4th-rounders, and 2 5th-rounders to go with a 7th in there as well. That's a bunch of great team-building capital to add a bunch of quality young players to surround Justin Fields, plus, the 100 and whatever $1 million of cap space the Bears are going to have this offseason. Definitely number 1 in the league, and I don't know exactly what the number is now with the Roquan Smith trade and whatever trades might still happen throughout the rest of the day. And now it's like, okay, Ryan Poles, here's your clean slate. Here's your cartoon money bag, like burlap sack with a dollar sign on it. Here's your cartoon bag of money, and here's your draft picks. Go build a team. And it's like, it's all on Ryan Poles now. He's got his clean slate, and it's a lot of faith from ownership to say, all right, you've torn this down. Let's see what you can do. Because, if hypothetically here, if Ryan Poles misses on some of those big free agents and misses on some of those draft picks, you're screwed, right? I mean, your team is going to be screwed because you've moved on from, a young, talented player like Roquan Smith that you had the cap space to re-sign and could have locked in as a part of your team, but chose not to, and perhaps for the better of the long-term future of the Chicago Bears. It's certainly the bet that he's making in this decision, and the Bears are giving him that free rein to say, yeah, go and make your moves, go and get, if you think you can build the team better. It's hard to find Roquan Smiths. I certainly understand the move and don't think it was a bad decision. But in the grand scheme of team building process, it's hard to find Roquan Smiths. And you look around, good teams don't usually build through free agency. They build through the draft, and the 9 draft picks are going to be the integral part of that. But you're going to have a bunch of salary cap space to spend, and that's not really where you're going to build your team. And maybe they can use a decent chunk of that re-signing some of your own players. You would have thought like Roquan Smith could have been a big part of how you use that money, but contract extensions maybe for Darnell Mooney and Jalen Johnson, we'll see. But it's certainly not the time of the year yet where we can look at the open free agent market and say, oh, what if the Bears sign this player or that player? Because a lot of the top names on the market are going to be re-signed by their respective teams. So we're not going to take the time on the podcast just yet until we get into the offseason and start looking ahead at like specific free agent opportunities for the Chicago Bears. But they're going to have a ton of cap space and a ton of draft picks, and they can really reload and retool around Justin Fields this offseason with everything Ryan Poles has created for them. And if they can do it right, you can really see the makings of a really talented team with all the resources they have. And if they do it wrong, you could certainly see a lot of wasted opportunity with all of the resources that they have. But clearly Bears ownership is saying, yep, do what you want to do. Demolish this roster as you need to and get the players you think are going to be the best fit. And if he's right, he can be very right and be a hero in Chicago for a long time. And if he's wrong, he could be added to the list of general managers that have generally been wrong in some of their team building decisions for the Bears. At the very least, it's going to be a thrilling, exciting offseason of so many possibilities and a lot of hope, I think, with draft picks and free agency. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves to the offseason, still got the rest of this year to go. And we'll take a look at what the more on-field impact of Roquan Smith's departure could be on this Bears team and what A.J. Klein might bring in exchange next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks, the better way to do daily fantasy football. Because unlike the other forms of daily fantasy, PrizePicks puts you in complete control. You're not playing against other players and you're not dependent on what they put on their daily fantasy choices. No, it's totally you versus the house. You're in complete control. You pick 2 to 5 players and whether they'll score more or less than their PrizePicks projection. And you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. Not just for football, where you can bet Justin Fields' passing yards, David Montgomery's rushing yards, Darnell Mooney's receiving yards, and much, much more. But across all the sports, including college sports and WNBA, NASCAR, tennis, boxing, disc golf, cricket, and so much more. It's really easy to make entries. Just takes 60 seconds or less, and it's operational in 30 states and Canada. So just download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. You deposit $50, PrizePicks gives you $50. Just don't forget to enter that promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for that instant deposit match up to $100. Much like the Robert Quinn trade, we know the Bears don't send Roquan Smith to the Ravens thinking that it's going to make their defense better right now. I mean, considerably, you're losing, an all-pro, Pro Bowl caliber player who admittedly has had his ups and downs. And we've been plenty critical of Roquan Smith on this podcast. And so I don't want it to be revisionist history now or that sort of like, not Stockholm syndrome, but one of those where, well, after the Roquan Smith trade is gone, you justify it for yourself and say, oh, well, he wasn't even all that good anyway, and the Bears will be fine. Like, let's make sure that we're consistent here. That on this podcast, we've been critical of Roquan Smith, and I'm also not here to say the Bears are going to be fine, right? I mean, this made their defense worse. I don't think it's as drastic as, it could be, but I think the trade value that the Ravens gave you kind of show where Roquan Smith is. This was not a first-round pick type of trade player, a trade pick and re-sign him to a contract, give him the first-round pick because he's that good and he's that worth it. It's a second and a fifth, which is still a lot for a player at a position that's not a very premium in terms of positional value in the league. And the Bears still got a pretty good return on investment there. So there's going to be certainly a loss there. Presumably, A.J. Klein, who they acquired, should eventually fit in that specific Roquan Smith role as the weak side linebacker in this defense. That's been some of the role he's played before in Baltimore and elsewhere in the league. And I don't know that 6 days, from the time that's not even the time he gets to Chicago, which will probably be today. So it'll be then 5 days until the Bears play again. That doesn't seem like a lot of time for someone to get in here and learn a brand new defense and get up to speed and be ready to like start and play every snap the way Roquan Smith did, in his absence. I'm not sure exactly what to expect on the timeline of that turnaround. In the meantime, I would suspect if A.J. Klein is not ready to go right away, that it would be Joe Thomas and then Nick Morrow at the middle linebacker and then Jack Sanborn, who we started to also see get some snaps last week in that rotation. But I do think the plan is likely for A.J. Klein to take over a bigger role in this defense for the remainder of the season. Let's be clear, too, about expectations for A.J. Klein. He's not very good, right? He's on the bench in Baltimore for a reason. He's been a starter before in his career. I don't think he's ever really been a high-end starter. I liked him quite a bit coming out of Iowa State in the draft. I thought he was an athletic guy, but just hasn't quite put it all together just there. And so, there's a reason why Baltimore was more willing to move on from a player like that in a trade. But the Bears, they still wanted to get some kind of body at the position in return, right? It's important to have a veteran here with some experience that offers you a little bit more in that department than undrafted free agents like Sterling Weatherford and Jack Sanborn, which by all means, big Jack Sanborn guy. I've met Jack Sanborn. I'm a fan of the human being and a fan of the linebacker, and would love nothing more than to see him thrive in Chicago. But he hasn't played very many snaps before, and that can be a problem. That when you're facing NFL offenses that are going to attack you. So Klein can be a little bit more of a potential stabilizing force there with some real experience, but it's not going to quite be the same in that regard. You're not going to have the dynamic athlete that Roquan Smith was. And he had some very great instincts in coverage, and he made interceptions. He made plays on the ball. He was quick to attack downhill, and we've seen him be able to use that speed to run around blocks and blow up plays sometimes and really show you some of those flash moments. Maybe not enough of the flash moments to be the $20 million linebacker that he wanted to be, but that doesn't mean he wasn't still a very good linebacker. And you move on from a very good linebacker and replace him with a, okay linebacker, you're going to notice that kind of a drop-off. I'm also almost even more, I don't know about more concerned. I don't know how to measure tangibles versus intangibles, but in terms of what we talked about with Roquan Smith, with Robert Quinn also, is the leadership aspect we saw how upset Roquan Smith got when Robert Quinn was traded, and now Roquan Smith gone too. And so their teammates, that defense, back-to-back weeks, has lost two of its prominent leaders, the prominent voices, the prominent faces, the prominent presences in that locker room. And that can be really hard to not only just process and compartmentalize emotionally in 5 days and get ready to go play again, but also, just like longer term to kind of have guys like be dialed in and trust the process here and see man, our defense keeps getting worse. They're trading away our good players. Do they want to win here? Do they care about winning? Should I care about winning? Am I going to put my body on the line as hard 100% at all times when the front office is getting rid of our best players and not putting a priority on winning next week's game, right? The Brian Poles is clearly saying in these two trades, winning this year is not as important for us as getting these draft picks and building in the long term. And so if you're a player, is it a little bit harder to say, wait a minute, well, if winning this year is not as important to them, should winning this year be as important to me? And how they sell this and smooth this over in the locker room is really going to be one of the bigger challenges of Matt Eberflus's tenure so far. I mean, we saw the defensive effort after Roquan Smith was traded, when some questionable effort at times and the spirit and the hustle not quite fully there against the Dallas Cowboys. How will it be against the Miami Dolphins this week? Will they be dialed in and fired up and locked in, or will there be that sort of emotional letdown and the void of not having Roquan Smith being that voice in that room? Who's going to step up and be a leader? They made Eddie Jackson the captain to replace Roquan Smith, but who else is going to step up? You only have so many guys that can step into those leadership roles and truly command a room, and we'll see how they're able to handle that without Roquan Smith. I guess the slight silver lining there, I don't know if it's a silver lining, but it's the slight benefit, bonus, the slight extra thing in here, I don't know what the word is going to be for it, was that they went through this when Roquan Smith was holding out. He missed the preseason and training camp and stuff. They didn't have Roquan Smith then. He was at least in the building, though, and that's the big difference, right? His presence was around. He just wasn't on the field, but at least this defense has seen life without Roquan Smith already at some point, and so maybe that makes it slightly easier or slightly less disruptive or slightly more familiar to not have him out there, but I still think that's going to be as big of a challenge as what's missing on the field. But we already knew the defense gave up 49 points to the Cowboys with Roquan Smith out there, so how much worse can it get then without Roquan Smith out there? Maybe we'll find out against another high-powered offense in the Miami Dolphins this week. And maybe they're not done moving players in the trade market. Again, trade market moves fast, and maybe by the time you're listening to this, another trade will have already happened. But we'll look at what some of the possibilities might be, or at least some of the dynamics that go into those decisions next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is powered by our friends at BetOnline, your number one source for all of your sports betting needs, not only for this football season, but also the start of basketball season as well. I've been putting some money down on the last couple of Bears games, and to be honest, I did well against the Patriots, did not do as well against the Dallas Cowboys. Right now, the Bears are 4.5-point home underdogs against the Dolphins on BetOnline. The over-under for that game set at just 44 points. And given how the last two Bears games have been higher scoring in both directions, wonder if an over might be in the mix there. The money line is Bears plus 175. But again, not just Bears football, all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, and in-depth analysis on every game. BetOnline is here with all your sports wagering needs, live betting, and up-to-minute scores for every sport out there. Head over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about all the different trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. So we knew the Bears trade action was going to start with Robert Quinn. We knew that Roquan Smith was a possibility, even if it felt a little distant. And even after the Roquan Smith trade, you've had Bears and I think some national reporters as well sort of say, hey, maybe Chicago's not done yet. There's still whispers in league circles of the Bears maybe making another type of trade. And no one has put a specific player's name on it just yet. But there's the speculation and the talking around and the reading between the lines circles the candidate or the possibility as David Montgomery. That the reporters kind of said, hey, and this is the logic we talked about a week or so ago on the podcast about, hey, like what could be in store for the Bears at the deadline. That you have so much cap space this offseason, $100 million plus, that you are not going to get any compensatory draft picks this year. That you're going to sign more free agents than you let go of. And so any player who's about to become a free agent, you're going to get nothing from if you do not re-sign them, if you just let them walk. And so at the trade deadline, you could choose to trade some of those players that are set to become free agents, like Roquan Smith, and get something for them in terms of draft capital, rather than just letting them walk and having no chance at getting a compensatory pick for them this offseason. That's where David Montgomery enters the fray, because he's kind of the main expiring contract on the Chicago Bears that has some real trade value to potentially to another team. They don't really have a lot of other guys that you look at and say, yeah, like some other team might want to trade for this player because they could be a real good difference maker. Because if there'd be a real good difference maker for another team, the Bears would probably end up keeping them, don't you think? And so that's where you kind of circle the equation with David Montgomery, plus Khalil Herbert running so well for this team and looking like just as good, if not sometimes better than David Montgomery as a runner. Montgomery may be better pass protection and overall trusted a little bit more in the passing game. but you also have Tristan Ebner. And so kind of like the Roquan Smith discussion, you ask yourself as a general manager, Ryan Poles, am I going to re-sign David Montgomery this offseason? How much of a priority is it for me to re-sign David Montgomery this offseason? And if other teams are willing to offer him more money, will I let him walk? And if those questions are yes, then trade him now and get a draft pick for him as opposed to letting him walk in free agency. Similar to like the Roquan Smith thing. It's like, well, I don't know if we're going to be able to re-sign him, and it's going to be a headache if we franchise tag and try and trade him. He doesn't have an agent. This could be messy. Let's trade him now and get something for him. I don't think you're going to like the type of return on investment you get in David Montgomery for a trade. You're probably looking at a 5th round pick, maybe a 5th and a 7th. I don't think a 4th or higher is realistic at this point. And so it doesn't feel like much, but again, it's sort of better than nothing when you're already sort of packing it in for the rest of the season. If you're content with saying, yes, I'm not going to re-sign David Montgomery. If re-signing David Montgomery is a priority for Ryan Poles, then he holds on to him and makes a run at making sure he stays in the team. Absolutely. But like you look at the rest of the Bears pending free agents, it's a lot of guys they just signed this year. Byron Pringle, Nick Morrow, N'Keal Harry, Matthew Adams, Michael Schofield, Mike Pennell, Dante Pettis, Kari Blasgame, Equanimeous St. Brown, Sam Mustipher. Like those guys are not going to get draft picks on the trade market. They're just not. And so it's pretty much that David Montgomery or bust in terms of expiring players. The other name that I've seen Bears fans throw out is Eddie Jackson, but I just don't think, I think the way Eddie Jackson has played and the way the team has talked about Eddie Jackson, I don't know that there's a huge priority to trade him. I say that now, and maybe he's the one they do end up moving on from because, there wasn't like a huge necessarily like immediate need. You could have franchise tagged and traded Roquan Smith, right? You didn't have to specifically say like he was going to be the guy that gets traded. But so maybe they look at Eddie Jackson's contract and say, yeah, the $14+ million that he's getting right now, if we're going more long-term in the rebuild, he's still a younger player. So is Roquan Smith, but he's due, let's see, $17 million next year and $18 million the year afterward. Would you take a draft pick for that? And you could start DeAndre Houston Carson the rest of the season, and maybe you can get a decent draft pick for Eddie Jackson because he's under contract. I think he's probably, the way he's playing right now, the way he's rebounded, he's probably worth $17 million next year. He's young, staying healthy, playing well, looking like classic Eddie Jackson and an important fit in this Bears defense. Whereas Roquan Smith was not playing like he was going to be worth the money he would be getting on his contract, and Robert Quinn was not worth the money he was going to be getting on his contract. So I don't think there are similarities, sure, and that's why you can't say never, and you can't say it would be a huge stunner if they traded Eddie Jackson. Certainly his value is going to be at its highest right now with his 4 interceptions on the season and really playing well. But to me, it does seem different enough that I do think there's a real valuing of Eddie Jackson in this process that I think is they value Jackson more than they did Robert Quinn and Roquan Smith from a dollars and cents standpoint and from where he fits in this team building process. And I think he and Jaquan Brisker are just really good fits next to each other. I think the Bears just have less incentive overall to move on from Eddie Jackson. Don't rule it out. I think if they're going to trade away somebody, it's him or David Montgomery as the 2 prime candidates. I've also heard Tevin Jenkins, but he's young and on a rookie contract. I just don't think that's likely to happen at this stage either, unless there's more going on behind the scenes there that we just don't know. Also, don't rule out the possibility of the Bears adding a player via trade. When you have all these draft picks and all that cap space, you're only trading for a player that you think can be a long-term piece on your team. And, I come back to DJ Moore of the Carolina Panthers only because he's a big, expensive contract and a young wide receiver, and the Bears all of a sudden can afford that big, expensive contract. But Ryan Poles is not trading that first-round pick. He's not trading either of those 2 second-round picks. He's probably not trading that 3rd-round pick either. I mean, never say never, but doesn't feel like he's in a position where he wants to give up any sort of premium draft picks. And so probably takes DJ Moore out of the equation that way. And I wouldn't get your hopes up for some sort of big blockbuster player the Bears are able to add. But just don't be surprised if the Ryan Poles wheeling and dealing continues through the trade, up to, I guess, the trade deadline. If the Bears make another big trade, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Make sure you're keeping up with our videos on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel as well. Click that like button on the video that you watch and make sure you hit that little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of any and all of our new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen or watch today, no matter how you consume Locked On Bears. We really appreciate you tuning in and getting your Roquan Smith update. And of course, we break down all the games and preview all the games and go in depth in the tape and try and make you a smarter Bears fan in the process. If you're looking for your second listen, now that we're wrapping up Locked On Bears, make sure you check out Locked On Sports today. It's taking you beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide. All of your biggest stories in all of sports wrapped up for you every day in 30 minutes or less. Wherever you get your podcasts, Locked On Sports today. Come on back for Locked On Bears tomorrow and that next opportunity for you to bear down.